Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to this panel, Sensing Profits, Neoliberalism and the Wall Street Climate Consensus. My name is Aaron Bastani. I'm co-founder of the media organization Novara Media and author of Fully Automated Luxury Communism, out now with Verso Books. Don't be put off by the title, and I assure you it makes a very good Christmas present, but that's not what we're here for. I'm delighted today to be joined by two eminent individuals in the field, which we'll be discussing. Chien-Yi Lu, who is an associate research fellow at the Institute of European and American Studies at Academia Sinica in Taiwan, and Daniela Gabor, who is a professor of economics and macrofinance at the University of West England. In addition to thanking both of our esteemed guests, I'd also like to thank the organisers of this event, Tax Justice Network, who continue to do outstanding work on the issue. And I think it's really important to say, you know, on the left and amongst progressives, on the centre left, on the centre, you know, the last 10 years have been a decimation for progressive causes. But I think one of the unique outliers is the issue of tax justice. It's clearly an issue of huge issue salience to the public at large. And I think that's entirely because of the work of organisations, activists in and around the Tax Justice Network. So thank you very much. This conference asks how we might pay for the climate transition. And of course, the answer would appear to be quite simple: public funds. Yet in terms of increasing tax to pay for the transition, particularly through taxing the poor, most particularly in a post-COVID context, this would be not only ethically questionable, but probably quite hard to deliver politically. At the very moment, climate change is gaining salience across the public, as is tax justice. It is perfectly possible that the right might try to build a cross-class coalition against the necessary measures. Here's a great quote from a Gilets Jaunes protester last year: "They worry about the end of the world. We worry about the end of the month." It's a memorable and important formulation. In the work of Chien-Yi Lu, specifically her work Surviving Democracy, Mitigating Climate Change in a Neoliberalized World, it is the very model of neoliberalism that is driving the climate crisis. Its core trick, the appearance of empowerment through choice and individual agency, while dismantling the very things which could lead to solutions, the possibility of collective action, and the state as a site of empowerment and problem solving. Within such a paradigm, Chien-Yi argues, attempts to mitigate and address climate warming based on individual empowerment will invariably and inevitably fail. The problem with neoliberalism is simply not one of government inaction, but also our very conception of the good life and of politics. Daniela Gabor posits two ways to think about how to finance decarbonisation and ensure we can live within our planet's biocapacity. One follows the logic of the Green New Deal, triptych of words we're all familiar with by now, I think, with state-led green industrial and monetary policies and big penalties for polluters responsible for what we call negative externalities. The other status quo route involves private financing and relying on market-based solutions, something which, again, we've done really since the early 1990s, and the general admission by policymakers that climate change is a major issue. So far, it's not doing very much. A major issue with the second approach, which Daniela calls the Wall Street Climate Consensus, is that it could discredit the entire movement if it provides merely one more opportunity for wealth extraction by a rentier elite. This won't just lead to inadequate measures, which is of course perilous in itself, but could create a justified political kickback from the 99%. What both of today's speakers capture is the possibility of the extremely well-off not only profiting from this agenda, but simultaneously turning a majority of public opinion against the kind of action which is now urgently needed. This could mean they make money from decarbonisation while also discrediting a green agenda. So I'll hand things over to our two speakers. Thereafter, I will ask both of them a few questions, and then we'll spread things out to the audience where I'll take questions in threes. So Chien-Yi, it's over to you. Speak for approximately 7 minutes on your book, Surviving Democracy, Mitigating Climate Change in a Neoliberalized World. Over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for, I'm really honored to be part of this conference, and tons of thanks to Tax Justice Network for not only inviting me, but all the great work that you do. So I'm going to I'm going to share screen now, talking about my book, Surviving Democracy, Mitigating Climate Change in a Neoliberalized World. Okay. When talking about the climate transition, we need both the more mechanical technical aspects of the relevant knowledge and the more structural organic aspects of it. My book focuses on the latter and places climate change within the context of the neoliberal structure. I argue that unless we recognize the profound implications of the neoliberal structure, our mitigating efforts risk remaining tail-chasing exercises, with the neoliberal elites always many steps ahead of us to both cancel out our work and to profit from the delusion of meaningful mitigation. In the book, I highlight how completely incompatible neoliberalism is with democracy and what this means for the climate struggle. My complaint about the way neoliberalism is usually defined or understood is that it is they treat neoliberalism too much as a genuine economic theory or a school of thought or ideology. That to me is very dangerous, particularly for the climate struggle. Neoliberal economic theories were developed for a very specific reason. Let me first compare neoliberalism with climate denialism, and you'll see they have almost identical features. Both are driven by think tanks funded by big corporations. Both rely on what Hayek termed professional second-hand dealers in ideas to manipulate the cognition of the public. Denialism has climate science as its targeted victim. Neoliberalism, Keynes's theories. Climate denialism tries to sell pseudoscience. Neoliberalism, pseudo-economics. The goal of both is enclosure, exclusion, and upward redistribution. So for obvious reasons, they cannot be honest with their agenda. So creating theories that come across as inclusive is absolutely essential. Even though these two enterprises are identical in their logic, and neoliberalism is in fact the one that is foundational to the global socioeconomic order, we tend to only see climate denialism as deliberately fraudulent, but not neoliberalism. So in my book, I define neoliberalism as the art, as in con artist, of exclusion through inclusion, with upward power and wealth redistribution as its goal. So exclusion means people are routinely and knowingly exploited and treated as dispensable. The COVID pandemic should make this very clear. People in maturely neoliberalized societies are very vulnerable. Meanwhile, wealth and power shifts further upward. That's precisely the way the system was designed to do. So looking back, neoliberalism's successful campaign against Keynes's theories turns out to be very significant for human history, because among other things, it sealed off options we otherwise would have had for fighting climate change. Under Keynes's theories, capital would be in check, power and wealth less concentrated, democracy would work, and there would be little room for science bashing or rampant pseudoscience. Timely reaction to climate change would be possible. Under neoliberalism, we have fake economics, fake science, fake news. And there's ever more concentration of wealth and power. And that means asymmetrical capacity for infowar. Democracy is reduced to nominal democracy or zombie democracy. So the public is essentially barred from participating in decisions regarding their health, lives, climate, the planet. World according to neoliberalism is where market is self-regulating and it alone knows the best. job of government is just to make sure nobody intervenes in the free market. And emphasis on individual responsibilities. Here, I don't have time to go into methodological individualism and economics and imperialism, but maybe during the Q&A. And the real world is, of course, the very opposite of what neoliberals tell us. We live in a world best characterized by what I would call scammed. State and corporations sit above the market and democracy. Neither the hands of governments nor those of corporations are off the market. Far from it. Concentrated wealth feeds into concentrated power, feeds into capability for infowar, which then feeds back into concentration of wealth. It's not even a closed loop, it's an upward spiral. So the meaning of the scam structure include that what you thought were spontaneous, voluntary economic activities were actually the doings of the scammed elite. Polanyi said laissez-faire was planned, planning was not. That was exactly what had happened with neoliberalism. In my book, I compare the EU to Chile. Neoliberal constitutions aimed at placing lock and bolt on democracy were imposed on both. The scam structure, therefore, gives the elites veto power over climate mitigation. The EU actually came very close to have a union-wide carbon tax in the 90s. That was vetoed by the scammed elites. The backbone of EU climate policy became ETS instead. The emissions trading system is a classic example of the neoliberal scammed scheme with the artificial elite-created market that serves upward redistribution. Finally, the global scam structure has its own judicial system that supersedes national legislative, executive, and judicial power. That is the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, or investment court system. You are probably all very familiar with it because it's in CETA, in TTIP, in Energy Charter Treaty, and treaties like CPTPP, or in a lot of bilateral investment treaties. So COVID-19 consolidated the structure like all shocks and crises under neoliberalism. So over time, it becomes less necessary to resort to deception because power has now become so concentrated that coercion would do. So I sometimes wonder if it's not because we've already passed the tipping point of power and wealth concentration that will be doomed to see the tipping point of climate change pass. So is there any way out? Get the right people in power. That's incredibly important. And for that to happen, there need to be awareness about the structure of the scam. Make it common sense, make it the standard background information in climate narratives and strategies formation. And we need to also be aware of the profoundly organic nature of all struggles, because setbacking one provides oxygen or nourishment for the scam elites to crush other movements. And we also need to know that we are all victims plus hostages, human shields, facilitators of the structure, because it's not like people have a choice to opt out of the system even after they become aware of the nature of the structure. If the system is upward redistribution, then by definition, we are all condemned to exploit those below us because our own share is taken by those above us. So it is in this sense that the Green New Deal plays critical role. It is a device to defuse the bomb and to re-embed the market in society. That is again Polanyi's words. So thank you for listening.
Excellent. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. We will now pass over to our other speaker. I didn't want to interrupt because I was going to say 1 minute, 2 minutes, but that was superbly timed, in fact. We'll now pass over to Daniela Gabor, who will speak for 7 to 10 minutes. And then we'll go to the questions and the answers. Obviously, there's some latitude here, Daniela. If you go for 10 minutes and 12 minutes, I mean, that's absolutely fine. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for the invitation to my friends at the Tax Justice Network, and thank you for giving me a bit more time. I hope I won't take too much advantage of that. I want to pick up on something that Sven Giegold has said as a sort of tie into the remarks that I want to make today. And he, as I understood it, he argued that when we think about why the European New Deal, Green Deal is not new, one of the reasons why it's different from the sort of standard Green New Deals that we dream of in progressive circles is that it doesn't really deal with the power of financial capital, or it doesn't shrink financial capital in the conversations about how to design a transition to a low carbon economy. And I guess the message that I want to bring today is that financial capital is very much involved in the global debates about how to deal with the climate crisis, and very much in tune with the previous speaker. They are scamming one way or another the conversations around climate crisis. And I want to finish by thinking about what can we do potentially in terms of mobilizing in order to resist this, because there is a real danger that the climate agenda is getting hijacked. And I want to show you first the COP26 that will happen next year here in the UK under the UK presidency. It has a private finance work stream and under the leadership of Mark Carney, who used to be the governor of the Bank of England, and is widely regarded in central banking circles, but also in global regulatory circles, as a sort of eco-warrior that has been driving the fight for making central banks much more aware and much more responsive to the climate crisis. So Mark Carney has published the agenda for COP26, the private finance work stream, and that offers us a glimpse of what I call the Wall Street climate consensus, which is the idea that we should be working with private finance, we should be coordinating the decisions that the private financial actors make and rely on them to guide us in the transition to a low carbon economy. And I don't have time to take you through all of this. It's a fascinating read if you're a geek of finance like I am, but I just highlighted a couple of things that are important there in terms of the language, and the language so far is voluntary. So if we recognize that businesses and financial institutions do have a significant carbon footprint and they need to shrink it, we need, the approach is voluntary disclosure of these climate risks. And very important for central banks here in the sort of risk management angle is for central banks to include or to incorporate climate risks in their mandates in terms of monetary policy, financial stability, and market operations. So there is already a lot of work being done in sort of climate circles around how to think about involving private finance in the low carbon transition. And I want to think about all the work that is being done in terms of political strategy as under the banner of the Wall Street climate consensus. And this basically is a narrative that says we can maximize private finance for the environment if we provide the right signals and we put the right structures in place. We don't need to shrink the power of financial capital. We don't need to even work against or regulate financial capital. We can just work with private financial capital, and we will have a satisfactory solution to greening the financial system. And by greening the financial system, we can also green our economies. And that, to my mind, that is this political strategy that I call the Wall Street Climate Consensus is very much opposed in terms of the sort of ideological assumptions and the policies that that come from there to Green New Deal type of arrangements, where the state has to play a much bigger role in terms of providing public investments in green infrastructure and green industries, so it accelerates the transition to a low carbon economy. And if you ask me who is winning the battle at the moment, I think without doubt, I would say that the Wall Street Climate Consensus is very powerful. It has a lot of political energy behind it. This is why the COP26 articulates the kind of message that it does. And it will be an upstream hill battle in order to try to fight against it. And let me give you some evidence of, or some ideas about what this Wall Street Climate Consensus actually does as a political strategy. And it starts from the idea that we have in the global financial system, we have institutional investors like my pension funds or insurance companies or high net worth individuals or multilateral corporations that we don't manage to tax for reasons that the Tax Justice Network knows very well. These investors have lots of trillions of US dollars under management. And why don't we think about ways in which we can reorient these trillions of dollars away from dirty investments into sustainable investments? So that's the sort of overall guiding logic of the Wall Street Climate Consensus. And then once you make this the political question, how do you get institutional investors to direct their credit towards sustainable investment? Then there are several steps that have been taken or are being taken as we speak in order to make sure that, that we work with private finance. And the first step that is important, and I think it's important to understand these steps, there are lots of technicalities involved here, but it's important to understand these steps so we can formulate counter political strategies if you want. The first step is to define the rules of the game. In climate finance, the rules of the game are quite new for a variety of reasons. And the most important political battle that is being fought at the moment in terms of the rules of the game is what kind of analytical lens do we use in order to distinguish between green investments and dirty investments? How do we know that if my pension fund holds bonds issued by Shell, are these dirty bonds or are these green bonds? And that's a very important question because it already sets the terrain for working out what to do about dirty finance and what to do about green finance. So once these rules of the games are being defined, then the next question comes, what do you do once you can distinguish between green and brown and dirty assets, excuse me. And the regulatory framework, again, the regulatory battle is, again, very much at the moment won by private finance or by carbon financiers, because we only have policymakers in general and central banks in particular only are prepared to go only as far as asking for voluntary disclosure within a particular risk framework. I don't want to bore you with it, but we can do it in the question and answer session. And much more important, I think, once we go past the voluntary disclosure of exposures to climate events, then the idea is to create market conditions for sustainable financial products, to put in place a system of subsidies that encourages institutional investors and banks to turn to sustainable investments. There is also a question of fiscal measures that focuses on carbon pricing. I am very skeptical about this, but we can discuss it in greater detail. I think in what concerns finance, the rules of the game and the regulatory frameworks are far more important. And very quickly, why are these rules of the game very dangerous in terms of progressive political strategies? It's because they open up the space for a lot of greenwashing. And by greenwashing, I mean financial institutions who can pretend that their portfolios, the loans that they make and the bonds that they hold, that they are green, even if that's not the case. And that's why the rules of the game is important. And in this space of taxonomies that allows for greenwashing, we know that private institutions, credit providers, they have come up with a very clever way of identifying financial instruments as sustainable or green, and that is the ESG framework, which is a system of rating corporations on their environmental, social, and governance behavior. And it takes data on these three sort of broad categories, and it aggregates them into a single rating or a single score, right? So for example, if your shell you can have from FTSE or from MSCI, which are two private providers, you can get a AAA rated ESG or a AAA ESG rating, which means that if the central bank comes to my pension fund and asks it, show me the shell bonds that you have, are they green or not? My pension fund can say yes. This is not a problem. I've already checked for their ESG rating, and I am not concerned about their climate footprint. And the ESG approach is very well known in central banking circles, that it encourages a lot of greenwashing because there are private providers, and there is a very perverse system of incentives for these private providers to sort of make assets or to make financial instruments look much greener than they are. However, even if there is this recognition, and I think this is a very important point to make, even if central banks recognize and regulators in general recognize that the ESG approach, because it's private, it has the same problems as credit rating agencies, it has decided to go ahead with it. So, and the best example that I have here is from the European Commission, who has been applauded in many sort of global spaces because it introduced the first, well, it aims to introduce the first public taxonomy for identifying green or sustainable activities, implying that the rest are not green. But although this green taxonomy or environmental taxonomy is already in place, the European Commission still views the private ESG approach as critical for thinking about banking regulations. And paradoxically, and very politically controversial, it has given BlackRock, which is the largest global asset manager and a very, very well known, I would call BlackRock the largest greenwasher we have in the financial world. It has given BlackRock a contract to advise it on how to implement ESG rules into the banking regulation, which is another way of saying you're giving a tobacco company a contract to advise the NHS on how to help people smoke less. So that's where we are with the private taxonomies. Private finance has been able to sort of shape the terms of the conversation on green finance. And this goes beyond, in some ways, it goes beyond just the rules of the game, but it's becoming increasingly sort of obvious in the climate finance rules that are being put in place. And I'm just giving you some examples here of how much greenwashing and systematic greenwashing is taking place as central banks are telling everybody that we are looking at a world where the financial system will be greener much faster. The central banks are still sticking to this voluntary disclosure of climate risks. And here is an example from from yesterday that shows central banks' approach basically has no bite whatsoever. It is the most unambitious way of trying to green the financial system that I can think of. Banks and other non-bank financial institutions are writing the rules of the game. They are allowing or they are influencing regulators in creating good news stories about how green the financial or the policies that they are putting in place are. And that's an example from the pro-hydrogen push in the European Green Deal, which is quite interesting and shocking in many ways. And the most important, I showed you an example also from the Nature Conservancy as a evidence of the greenwashing that is happening in the carbon offset universe, which is again part of one of the miracle solutions to greening the financial system. But probably the most important aspect is that central banks and financial regulators more generally are not prepared to penalize dirty assets. In other words, to make lending to fossil fuel activities much more expensive than it is. Because if that is the logic of that we stay within financial capitalism and we just put in place different price signals in order to reorient credit from fossil fuels to green activities, not even on the terms of financial capitalism, this approach is working, because central banks are not prepared to make, or not yet prepared to make lending to dirty activities much more expensive than it is. And I want to finish with a more sort of upbeat message on what we can do in terms of political mobilization. And I think one of the most encouraging signals that I have seen for a while comes from the European Central Bank. And this is a sort of a battlefront that needs to receive a lot more support from civil society organizations and from green parties all over Europe, because the European Central Bank, under the mandate of, or under the leadership of Christine Lagarde, is prepared to drop a fundamental principle of central banking, which says you shouldn't get involved into the credit allocation decisions of the market. You should preserve market neutrality. And we know this in practice, the myth of market neutrality has been very well established. But once central banks are prepared to say that we don't care about market neutrality anymore, then they can start to take very significant steps towards penalizing dirty finance. And we've published a paper recently with several co-authors where we make suggestions about how central banks can, for example, stop buying in unconventional policy measures. They can stop buying the bonds issued by fossil fuel companies because they still do it. And by doing so, they basically subsidize fossil fuels while they pretend that Europe has a Green Deal. There are various other measures that can be put in place in order to accelerate the greening of the financial system. They're quite technical and I don't want to bore you with them. I think the overall message, the overall political message that one can take from looking at how financial capital is responding to the climate crisis is to say that they are no longer within this, what the previous speaker described as this neoliberal rejection or denial of the climate crisis. No, financial capital accepts that there is a climate crisis, and what it is doing now is putting in place measures to protect their profits via central banks from extreme climate events. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here.
Brilliant. Two excellent speakers. Thank you very much, Daniela. I'm going to pose a question to both of you quickly, and then we'll take some of the questions from the people watching right now. So the question I have really for Chien-Yi is and I think it's a very compelling hypothesis, I agree with it, but where I would say I'm not quite sure of your footing is, the problem here is neoliberalism. Why not just say liberalism? Because for me, with regards to our inability to act effectively with regard to climate change, I look at the liberal idea of a negative sphere of liberty is hugely problematic, the separation of the state and the market, classical political economy. So there's a question really, why are you saying neoliberalism is the problem here rather than liberalism? Or let me rephrase that, liberal political economy, which is 200 years old.
Yeah, I think neoliberalism refers to, I think they themselves first used the term neoliberalism by, at least by Milton Friedman and probably Walter Lippmann. I think they wanted to differentiate themselves from laissez-faire economics. So they had this gesture, this facade that it's for everybody. It's not like the 19th century cruel, cold-blooded laissez-faire liberalism. So when I say neoliberalism, in my book I looked specifically at the period starting from post-war period with Hayek, and very importantly his business funders, the Mont Pelerin Society. I think most people know Mont Pelerin Society. It serves that as a network doing R&D, research and development. They develop ideas, they disseminate ideas, and then later on use Reagan and Thatcher to put it through into the policy world. But in the kitchen, they've been cooking, they have been doing R&D for a long time. So the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, and later Adam Smith Institute, and later on there's the Atlas Network, tons of think tanks, including like Cato Institute and Heritage Institute. And then they also have close ties. Actually, the Charles Koch brothers, they were very inspired by Hayek and the Mont Pelerin Society. So you can see that small networks spin into very large and very powerful network. And then from there, there's think tanks especially devoted to climate denialism, like Heartland Institute and George Marshall Institute. So it's like they have done a lot of development. And I also focus on a person an economist named James Buchanan. He is incredibly influential because he tried to, there's this term, economics imperialism. He developed things like public choice theory, rational choice theory, so that he wants to go beyond the discipline of economics, to go to like disciplines like political science and law, legal studies, so that in every academic disciplines, it's neoliberalized. So the graduate program students trained, they will see the world as a neoliberal world. It's naturalized. Their theories, their arguments, which were developed for the reason of upward redistribution, was publicized incredibly. And now even in the academics, it's very difficult to reverse this trend, even though maybe in critical studies, you will feel comfortable criticizing this. But otherwise, even when people use neoliberalism, the term freely, but they are still pretty much within the mainstream of the neoliberal thinking. And it's very toxic. It's like the soil is poisoned, and then the tree, the trunk, the leaves, it's all toxic.
There's a wonderful book on James Buchanan, Democracy in Chains.
Yeah, I cite that book. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think it's one of the best books I've read in the last couple of years. Yeah,
that's where my idea of comparing the EU to Chile came from. I read that book, and because she was talking about the United States and Chile. But if you look at how independent the central bank is in Europe, it's worse than the United States. And also the austerity after the sovereign debt crisis, I hardly see the difference. It's the same thing. It's a neoliberal constitution designed to lock democracy in chains to be imposed on society.
So let me go to Daniela now. I'm going to try and tie that response into a question I'll ask you, Daniela, because you're saying that what's happening with people who are seeking returns on capital, whether it's institutional investors, whether it's high net worth individuals, pension funds, the people making these decisions now recognize the ecological, hydrological, political, social reality of climate change. It's happening. And you're saying that now steps are being taken in order to maintain profits through various instruments or various investments or various forms of government regulation, which are to their advantage, but actually don't really help with regards to decarbonisation, or at least as quickly as we'd like. But then how do you square that? Or where do people like the Koch brothers fit in? Because there are extraordinarily wealthy people who are funding still climate denialism. Are they, should we understand them as a kind of fragment of capital, of the capitalist interest, or are they just kind of eccentric, so in 5-10 years will just no longer be around?
Thank you. This reminds me of the conversations we used to have in feminist circles when international development institutions started to mainstream gender in development interventions, and we all realized as feminists that we kind of lost the battle, although it seemed like we had won it, because then gender became a sort of empty signifier that didn't mean anything anymore. So to me, the worry is not so much the Koch brothers or the people who remain committed to this climate denialism. They are not the problem, because you can basically work against them. To me, the more complicated political issue and the most pressing one is, what do you do when your allies are actually not what they pretend to be your allies? They are not really your allies. And when the financial capital realizes that the sort of the posts of the game has changed, the goalposts have moved, and they are moving with them, and they're starting to move the goalposts themselves. And this is where I think is the most pressing political issue for us not to look at the climate denialists, because I think they're a much smaller and less powerful group than they used to be 5 years ago, but to ask ourselves, how is it possible that BlackRock gets a contract for advising the European Commission on how to green finance when it itself is a carbon financier, right? This is the new enemies that of the climate crisis, of the climate movement, if you want, are much more sophisticated than, and it's not simply that they have sort of cash behind them, that they have financial power, but they also are embracing the narrative that we are putting forward, which is the climate crisis is urgent, that we need to address it. And they say, yes, I'm on your side now. Let me tell you how to deal with it.
I think that's a really interesting, not tension between you guys, because obviously there's truth to both sides, but I think that's a really interesting sort of potential point of departure. Right, so we're going to take some questions now from the audience. We've got 20 minutes to go here. If people who are putting their comments in the chat, if you in the Q&A box, that would be much appreciated. And if the two respondents could be quite brief, because obviously we want to get through, I think, 5 or 6 questions here. This is from Carolyn. Chien, I'm worried that the Stern ideology scammed argumentation might by rhetorics be thrown in one basket with nonsense conspiracy theories. Any idea how to set up, how to communicate in order to win majorities for the right people in power? So to paraphrase, Chien, just to clarify, I agree with your analysis, but it's true that when you're asserting a certain elite are behaving in a way which is relatively obscured from the public at large, that can tend towards conspiracy theories. There's no two ways about it. So how can you articulate this as a mass politics when people, by nature of the points you're making, can't discern this elite? They can't see them generally. They're not on the same road as them. So are there any sort of political examples out there you can point to and say, these guys are doing what we all need to do?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's what I mean when I said there's asymmetrical power in InfoWar, because they have all the means, all the money, all the think tanks, all the people to naturalize what they want us to believe is the normal, natural world. And I don't deny that it's very difficult. And I know that my argument may come across as kind of conspiracy theory. But I'm trying to make the point that instead of looking at the theories or the arguments of the neoliberals, look at the history, the process, look behind the scene, why they invented these theories and how these are well documented. So after we understand for example, James Buchanan that I mentioned, if you look at his work, it's almost like he asks questions, but he already has the answer. He has the answer, and then he goes back, trace back to how can I construct it so it looks like a legitimate research. So it's the history of his academic work. So if we look at that, because in climate, I agree with Daniela that their strategy has changed. Before it was explicit denialism. So now their strategy is I'm your ally. And so what I mean is only if we understand the arguments that they put forth has some background or backstage incentives and method and strategies, only when we understand that, we will be able to cultivate or develop a healthy sense of skepticism. So we will be more aware of front groups and false allies who are kind of agreeing with us at front, but they are doing something else behind the scene. So I know it's very difficult, but I guess we have to, at least if you think about in the US election that still 70-something million voters voted for Trump. I think it's not possible for us to change the minds of everybody, but at least some people in the middle, they may waver. And if we present more arguments and evidence and show them that behind the scene, these arguments are cooked with some kind of incentives that's to take things away from us to redistribute upwards, then maybe some people in the middle can change their minds, and then the right people can be put into power.
Okay, so like I say, if you can keep answering 30 seconds now, because I'm going to get through all these questions. Here's a question from James Henry. I think this is more really to you, Daniela. Please, or both of you can answer if you like, but I'll put this to you, Daniela. Please put some institutional names on the beast. Who are the precise leading proponents? So I'll ask that in a separate way. Yes, you've already said BlackRock. Can you talk about some more of the organizations most responsible for the things you're talking about? At the same time, how useful is it to focus just on individual corporations? Does that sort of detract from talking about it more structurally, or should we say, these are the bad people, these are the people we need to change their behavior, let's do something about it?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question, because it brings to my mind the issue of what are the pressure points that we can identify. And I'm using the example of BlackRock because it's such an obvious example in relationship with the European Commission, but BlackRock is by no means alone. I mean, most large British banks are going to either oppose or play the same sort of Wall Street consensus climate game. Most large asset managers in Europe, most large insurance companies in Germany, for example, or I didn't have time to show you, but they, for example, the head of Allianz was saying, yes, we like the taxonomy of the European Commission, but the European Commission is not entitled to take away our right to use these private taxonomies that allow for more greenwashing. And now for the broader question of, and of course there are the lobby groups, so European Banking Federation. If you want to have a very quick insight to which are the relevant sort of financial capital actors, I suggest that you go to the website of the European Commission and you read or you click on one of the consultations on the Sustainable Finance Initiative, because this is where you kind of get a very good glimpse of what is happening in terms of the debates, because these financial institutions are compelled by some reason that I don't understand to respond to consultations that are public. And there you have a long list of financial institutions that are trying to sort of put their imprint on the green finance agenda, if you want names. Now, in terms of what is the political usefulness of singling out financial institutions, I mean, there are various arguments around it. I remember French protesters going to BlackRock in Paris and protesting in front of the BlackRock, very nice, very corporate building. That could be a strategy to sort of put political pressure by having Fridays for Future not march on governments, but march on private financial institutions. That would be a very different political strategy. I haven't thought of it very carefully, but I think it might yield some unexpected results. Yeah, I mean, I'll stop here and maybe we can go back to what are the structure versus individual question.
Yeah, well, I mean, 10 years ago, the idea that people congregating outside Vodafone and Top Man would have highlighted, tax avoidance by the likes of Philip Green would have been implausible, and yet now Philip Green's Emmy #1, quite rightly so. This is a good question, and again, brief as possible. Really, it's a huge question, as they all are. This is from Reinhard. We are citizens of the state, but we do not control the state. Do we need? That was a quote. Do we need measures such as democratization and compulsory transparency of central banks, democratic control of transnational corporations, and compulsory transparency of all financial flows? I mean, I guess I could I'll abbreviate that and say, should we be looking at things like political control of or political oversight of central banking? I mean, that seems to be something that, we should be talking about. I'll put that first to you, Daniela, and then to you, Chien-Yi.
I mean, I have to remind you that there is political oversight of central banks to the extent that central banks have mandates that are established by governments. They respond to treasuries in terms of the specific mandate that they are entrusted with. And there is a very big conversation in the world of central banking because, of course, not everybody is the same, and there are more progressive, let's call them central bankers, and more skeptical or conservative ones. But I would say, in general, I mean, either we want to sort of move toward a very different system of organizing our economy, which has less multinational corporations and more state-owned companies. I'm coming from one of those systems. As a kid, I grew up in communist Romania, and I have my doubts about whether we have the political will and the political strategies to go there. But I would say that the idea of transparency is not enough, because this is exactly what central banks are, this is their message now. Their message is, we need everybody to be more transparent about how much they are exposed to the climate crisis. And transparency is not sufficient as a political strategy if what is reported, what financial institutions are transparent about is decided by them, right? So in a sense, transparency to me doesn't go far enough. What we need is strong states that regulate not only for disclosure, but they regulate in order to make sure that you can't lend, if you want to lend to fossil fuel activities, it is very expensive for you to do so. So you don't make profits out of it.
Chien, what do you think of changes to, again, nominal independence of central banks has been a sort of key feature of the neoliberal architecture since the turn that you described just a moment ago with regards to Reagan and Thatcher. Is that something you'd like to see changed? I know they're mandated to oversee things like low inflation and so on, but could you envisage a different kind of central banking system?
Yeah, I agree with what Daniela said, and it's very obvious that the very, very independent, the independence of the central bank is the product of the neoliberal tricks. But I think I go back to my concern that unless the right people are put into office, all the transparency, all the necessary change to put people first rather than corporations or big banks first will never happen. And if the narrative does not include this message that the entire economic system is one of scam, is one that's designed to funnel money upwards, then voters will not have a healthy level of awareness that what we see as normal is actually not. So I come back to this point that unless the right people are in power, nothing will change. And if you look at, again, the US election, the primary election in Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders came quite close. If you compare that 2 years ago, that's progress. So more people can become aware of how much they have been lied to, and that then they can come to support the right people. I'm optimistic there. I think this part of change needs to happen very quickly. Otherwise, the power are in the hands of the wrong people, wrong person. Then we will never, even if we figure out a way to pay for climate transition, we will never have the chance to spend that money to pay for climate transition.
This is a question from Ashvid Sharma, who says, the second speaker, Daniela, mentioned that one of the next steps is to encourage and incentivize sustainable investments. Can you lay out how we might go about doing that? So, I mean, you probably wanted to expand on some of the key points you made there. So from a lay person's perspective, how might that look?
Okay, thank you for this question, because it allows me to reminisce about a very different political scenario that we had here in Britain when Corbyn was in charge of the Labour Party and John McDonnell was shadow chancellor. And with several colleagues, there were like 10 of us, we wrote a report for John McDonnell entitled A Progressive Green Finance Strategy for the UK, where we laid out in detail what would be the steps that are necessary in order to green the British financial system. It's still on the website of the Labour Party, I think, because the new administration hasn't got to the climate finance yet. I would say a couple of things that are important. First, it is important to make sure that the central bank has a very clear mandate and takes very significant steps to green the banking system by greening its monetary policy operations, by greening the regulatory regime. Then what we argue there as well, that there is a need to change the way in which we think about how we do macroeconomic policy. That is, we propose to create a green finance task force, we call it like that, where you would have the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury working together with the central bank to make sure that a very rapid transition towards green finance doesn't create financial stability risks, because this is one of the arguments that central banks make when they say, well, we have to be very incremental because we risk financial stability. And I don't think that's a very powerful argument, but it's one that we need to address. And we were arguing there that what we basically need is a sort of a reimagining of the Keynesian consensus of the 1950s to the 1970s, where the two arms of the state, the monetary and the fiscal arm, work much more closer together in order to green the financial system and to reduce the power of financial capital. Because incidentally, if you green the financial system, you simultaneously reduce the power of financial capital, because you basically force it into a much narrower set of markets than or of lending decisions than you would otherwise.
Excellent. Here's a question from John Christensen about the Mont Pelerin Society Atlas Network, along the lines of, where is the progressive equivalent of these powerful networks? So, Chien, where are they? Are they around and we're not seeing them? Are they emerging since 2008?
Tax Justice Network. And I think money does play a big role, because the kind of money that corporations can pour into the Atlas Network, you just don't have that kind of money on the side of the progressives. So because from very early on, those money, in my book, I talk about like Rockefeller Foundations and the William Barker Foundation and all sorts of oil companies and automobile companies. Of course, you don't find that kind of money on the side of the progressives. But I think maybe the internet, because right now there are more and more independent media on the web. So I have hope there, because it took me a long time to know not to trust the network, the media that I used to thought was very okay or very trustworthy. Took me a long time, but slowly I came to understand how things are. And I think I have hope that it's happening to other people and elsewhere too.
There's a very good book, Thinking the Unthinkable, about the IEA and Anthony Fisher. For Brits particularly, it's, you understand British politics a lot better after reading that. Here's the final question I think we're going to take. We've got 3 minutes left. This question is from Nicholas Shaxson to Daniela. Your arguments on Wall Street climate consensus are often well received, for good reason, in my opinion, in technocratic circles, technocratic arguments. So, I've just about kept up, even if the weight of dollars, pounds is against you. You have called for civil society to engage more in these crucial but technically difficult areas, ESG ratings and so on. Are there any civil society organizations taking this seriously and engaging, organizing, popularizing? Where are the most urgent gaps where civil society needs to engage? So a couple of minutes, maybe Max, if you want to respond to that, and that'll be the final question. So over to you, Daniela.
Thank you. There is an interesting conversation going on as well in the panel on my right-hand side. I don't know if other people can see it, but there is this idea in the civil society world, that green finance regulations don't matter that much. They will not have much of an impact anyways. What we need to do is to focus the political pressure on regulating of the real economy, because you won't, these are very technical issues, you won't get much out of them. Anyways, I very strongly disagree with that for a variety of reasons that have to do with my belief that credit creation in an economy is very important, and if you allow for credit to be extended to brown activities, they will, or to dirty activities, it will continue to do so. But I recognize that these very technical discussions around taxonomies and capital requirements are not going to mobilize a lot of public support. What I've been thinking and suggesting in several sort of spaces in the European Parliament is the possibility of a green financial transactions tax. Now, the financial transactions tax, I think it's a useful reminder for civil society organizations that regulating private finance or taxing private finance can be a very effective way of mobilizing public support, and can be also a very effective way of getting public resources or getting resources for the public to invest however it sees fit. And the political resistance to the FTT that we saw in the European Union and in Brussels from the financial sector suggests to me that they are very clearly aware that if you have a state that taxes transactions, it it can change the nature of capital allocation, and it can affect their profitability. So my answer to why don't civil society, or how do we make civil society organizations more engaged with this, is probably to find a rallying point around the green FTT, which basically would be a tax on assets that are loans to dirty activities or to dirty companies. And maybe that is a more effective way of organizing sort of our strategies towards finance towards private finance, instead of dismissing them. Because I think private finance is also very powerful in shaping the debates on how to regulate the real economy. And if we don't recognize that, then we're basically ignoring the white elephant in the room that is trampling on everything.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to end on. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Chien-Yi. And we're now going to pass over to the next session. That was very interesting. Thank you very much.